As the plane continued its steady ascent, Naomi sat quietly, her composure a stark contrast to the icy dismissal she'd received. The other passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the cabin palpable. But Naomi's father, Jonathan Green, had already set things in motion. Within minutes, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Mrs. Harper, please report to the cockpit immediately." The senior flight attendant's confident stride faltered, her expression shifting from control to confusion. She disappeared behind the curtain, and the whispers began. Moments later, the captain emerged, his expression a mix of calm and quiet authority. He approached Naomi with a warm smile, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "Miss Green, on behalf of our airline, I sincerely apologize. You are a valued guest, and you deserve nothing less than respect." As he spoke, Mrs. Harper was quietly escorted off the plane by security. The announcement that followed stunned everyone. "Mr. Jonathan Green, the owner of our airline, has instructed us to ensure every passenger feels valued and respected, no exceptions." The shift in the cabin was electric. Those who had looked away earlier now offered smiles and small nods of support. The businessman who had remained silent leaned over, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize. I should have said something." Naomi simply nodded, her quiet strength radiating through the room. Her calmness had spoken louder than any argument ever could. If this story resonated with you, please comment 1 below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this to light. Thank you for watching. Naomi Green sat quietly in her plush, first-class seat, her small hands resting on the smooth leather armrests. The soft hum of the airplane engines vibrated gently through the floor, a constant reminder that in just a few moments, she would be soaring through the sky on her way to New York City. For a 14-year-old, traveling alone for the first time, it was both exhilarating and a bit terrifying. Naomi had always been mature for her age, a calm and thoughtful girl with a knack for seeing the world through a lens of curiosity. She was the kind of kid who read science journals for fun and could lose hours to her telescope, gazing at the stars and wondering about life beyond Earth. It was this curiosity and drive that had earned her a top spot in the national science competition, a victory that brought not just pride to her family, but also recognition from her peers and teachers. As a reward, her father, Jonathan Green, had surprised her with this trip to New York, complete with a first-class ticket. He had wanted her to experience something special, a taste of the world she was working so hard to explore. But sitting there, surrounded by adults in crisp suits and polished jewelry, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. She wore a simple yellow sweater and jeans, her long braids pulled back into a neat ponytail. Her backpack, decorated with NASA patches and keychains from family road trips, sat neatly under the seat in front of her. She tugged at the hem of her sweater, a small, nervous habit, and took a slow breath, reminding herself that she had earned this, that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "You've worked so hard, Naomi. This is just the beginning. You deserve every bit of this." She had nodded then, smiling up at him. But now, miles away from home and surrounded by strangers, the confidence felt a little thinner. The aisle of the plane buzzed with quiet activity as passengers settled in. To Naomi's left sat an elderly woman with a warm smile and silver hair tucked into a loose bun. The woman had introduced herself as Martha, offering Naomi a butterscotch candy from her purse. "For the nerves," Martha had whispered with a wink. Naomi had accepted it with a shy "thank you," the sweet taste a welcome comfort. Martha's presence was soothing. She had the aura of a favorite grandmother, the kind who would sneak you cookies before dinner and tell stories of her own childhood adventures. Across the aisle sat Mr. Grant, a businessman in his 50s, his graying hair meticulously styled, his suit pressed to perfection. He had acknowledged Naomi with a polite nod when she first sat down, but had since buried himself in his tablet, the screen reflecting spreadsheets and emails. He seemed the type to keep to himself, focused on his work, uninterested in the world around him unless it directly affected his plans. His demeanor wasn't unfriendly, just detached, as if the small world within his device was far more pressing than anything happening around him. The plane's crew moved with practiced precision, their uniforms crisp, their smiles well-rehearsed. Mrs. Harper, the senior flight attendant, stood near the front of the cabin, giving instructions to the younger attendants. She was in her mid-40s, with neatly cropped blonde hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her voice was smooth, but held a certain edge, a no-nonsense tone that brokered little argument. She walked the aisles with purpose, her expression shifting seamlessly from welcoming to wary as she assessed each passenger. When she glanced at Naomi, her smile tightened, a brief flicker of something cold passing over her face before she turned away. Behind Mrs. Harper trailed Mia, a younger flight attendant who moved with a careful, almost hesitant grace. Mia couldn't have been more than 25, her dark curls pinned back neatly, her eyes a soft hazel. She seemed eager to do well, her smile warm but fleeting, as if afraid it might not be well received. She busied herself with small tasks, straightening pillows, adjusting trays, always a step behind Mrs. Harper and rarely making eye contact with the passengers. Naomi watched them, her curious mind piecing together the dynamics of the crew. She had a knack for observing people, picking up on the subtle shifts in body language and tone. She noticed how Mia's shoulders tensed when Mrs. Harper spoke to her, how the older woman's directives were given in clipped tones, often accompanied by a barely hidden sigh of impatience. It reminded Naomi of group projects at school, where a confident kid would take charge and make everyone else feel like they were just getting in the way. As the plane began to taxi, Naomi closed her eyes, gripping the armrests a little tighter. Martha reached over, her cool hand resting gently on Naomi's. "First time flying alone?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur over the rumble of the engines. Naomi nodded, her lips pulling into a small smile. "You're going to do just fine, dear. Just keep breathing." Naomi nodded again, the warmth of Martha's hand a small anchor. She allowed herself a moment of calm, focusing on the rhythm of her breath, the steady hum of the plane, and the promise of adventure waiting on the other side of the flight. What she didn't know was that this journey, meant to be a reward, was about to become a test of her strength and a lesson in standing up for herself in a world that often asked her to stay silent. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, her mouth dry from the recycled air circulating through the plane. She waited until Mrs. Harper passed by again, her movements precise as she served the other first-class passengers with sparkling water, fresh juice, and complimentary champagne. Naomi smiled politely, her voice soft but clear. "Excuse me, could I please get a glass of water?" Mrs. Harper paused, her blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if she hadn't expected to be addressed. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and for a moment there was only the hum of the plane filling the space between them. "We'll get to you when we can," she said, her tone edged with something sharp, almost cutting. Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and continued down the aisle, her heels clicking rhythmically against the carpet. Naomi sat back, a small furrow forming between her brows. She had watched Mrs. Harper serve every passenger around her without hesitation, pouring drinks with practiced ease, her laugh light and pleasant as she exchanged pleasantries. But when it came to Naomi, there was a chill, a deliberate pause, and then nothing. The discomfort in the air seemed to thicken. Martha shifted beside her, her expression tightening as she glanced toward Mrs. Harper's retreating figure. "That wasn't right," she whispered, just loud enough for Naomi to hear. Naomi managed a small nod, her fingers curling into the soft leather of the armrest. Across the aisle, Mr. Grant briefly looked up from his tablet, his expression unreadable, before he returned to his work, his silence as heavy as the unease now settling over the first-class cabin. Naomi's pulse quickened, the back of her neck prickling with the awareness that more than a few eyes had turned in her direction, only to quickly look away. The quiet was suddenly suffocating, every sound amplified, the clink of ice against glass, the murmur of conversation, the soft hiss of the air vent above her head. She took a slow, steadying breath, her father's voice echoing in her mind, reminding her to stay calm, to assess, to think. She reached for her phone, the familiar weight of it grounding her. Her fingers moved quickly, tapping out a message to her father. "I asked for water twice. The flight attendant is ignoring me." She stared at the screen for a moment before hitting send, a mix of frustration and a strange simmering hurt blooming in her chest. Her phone vibrated almost immediately. "What's your flight number?" She quickly sent the details, her heartbeat a steady drum in her ears. Another message appeared just a moment later. "Stay calm. I'm handling it." Naomi exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. Her father always had a way of making her feel safe, even from miles away. She slipped the phone back into her bag, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers still. Her expression remained composed, her posture poised, but beneath the surface, a quiet storm brewed. She wasn't one to make a fuss, to draw attention to herself, but this felt different. It wasn't just the water. It was the way Mrs. Harper had looked at her. The way her words had felt like a door shutting firmly in her face. Naomi's thoughts tumbled over one another, each more unsettled than the last. She had done nothing wrong. She had been polite, patient, and yet somehow she had been made to feel as though she did not belong, as though she had stepped into a space not meant for her. The cabin around her carried on, the world outside the small bubble of her seat moving forward without pause. Naomi remained still, a quiet force in a sea of motion, waiting, watching, knowing that this was not the end of it. Not by a long shot. Naomi sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched Mrs. Harper move gracefully down the aisle. The flight attendant's demeanor transformed with each passenger she approached, her smile warm, her voice melodic, a gentle laugh punctuating her conversations. She leaned close to a well-dressed woman with a pearl necklace, offering her a glass of champagne and sharing a quiet joke. The woman giggled, her manicured hand lightly touching Mrs. Harper's arm. For the businessman 2 rows ahead, Mrs. Harper poured a fresh glass of water, the ice cubes clinking softly as she set the glass down with a polite nod. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't just that Mrs. Harper was serving everyone else. It was how she did it, with genuine kindness and a softness that had been noticeably absent in her interactions with Naomi. When Mrs. Harper approached again, Naomi took a breath, steadying herself. She raised her hand slightly, a polite gesture, and asked, "Excuse me, could I please get some water?" There was a brief pause. Mrs. Harper's expression didn't change much, but there was a shift in her eyes, a momentary flicker of irritation that quickly settled into a practiced neutrality. Her voice dropped in temperature, the words coming out clipped and cool. "I told you, you need to wait." She didn't stop walking. The response landed like a stone in Naomi's chest, heavy and uncomfortable. She felt the warmth drain from her cheeks, leaving a prickling heat at the back of her neck. Naomi forced herself to breathe evenly, to hold her expression steady, but inside, something twisted painfully. A few seats away, Martha's face mirrored Naomi's confusion. She opened her mouth as if to say something but closed it again, her lips thinning into a line of quiet disapproval. Mr. Grant's tablet remained a perfect barrier, his focus still firmly on the glowing screen. The cabin seemed to shrink around Naomi, the walls pressing in as if to magnify the isolation. Her senses sharpened, each sound amplified, the rustle of newspapers, the tinkling of glass, the low hum of conversation that now felt like static in her ears. She sat straighter, lifting her chin slightly, her mother's voice whispering in her mind, reminding her to always hold her head high, no matter what. She had been raised to meet the world with grace, to match every cold glance with a warm smile, to never let anyone see that they had gotten to her. But this was different. This wasn't a passing comment or a subtle shift in tone. This was deliberate. Naomi could feel it in the space Mrs. Harper left between them, a gap filled with more than just air. It was a line drawn clearly, a boundary that told her she was on the outside looking in. She ran her thumb over the smooth edge of her phone, a reminder of her father's message. "Stay calm, I'm handling it." He had always been her champion, his calm strength a constant in her life. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this situation would right itself, that the discomfort prickling under her skin would fade. But as the minutes stretched, the cabin becoming a theater where she played the role of the invisible girl, Naomi felt a quiet resolve settle over her. She would not shrink into her seat. She would not let the weight of Mrs. Harper's dismissiveness bend her spine or dim her light. She shifted her gaze out the window, focusing on the sky, a vast expanse of blue that seemed to stretch forever. She reminded herself that beyond this plane, the world was wide and full of possibilities. This moment, small and sharp, would not define her. She might be waiting for water, but she would not wait to be seen. And while the plane cruised smoothly at 300 feet beneath the calm surface, a storm was brewing. Quiet, but undeniable. Naomi sat still, her expression calm but her mind racing. The cabin around her felt oddly detached, like she was sitting behind a glass pane, watching the world move on without her. She could feel the weight of Mrs. Harper's words pressing down on her, heavy and cold. "I told you, you need to wait." It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way they were delivered, each syllable sharp and dismissive, slicing through the polite hum of the first-class cabin. Martha leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with quiet strength. "That's not right, sweetheart. Stay strong." The warmth in Martha's eyes was a small comfort, a reminder that not everyone on this plane had chosen to look the other way. Naomi nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement that she understood, that she appreciated the gesture, even if it was just a whisper in a sea of silence. Across the aisle, Mr. Grant's shoulders seemed to tighten. His eyes flicked up from his tablet for the briefest of moments, catching the exchange between Naomi and Mrs. Harper. His lips pressed together, the corners of his mouth pulling down just enough to show that he had noticed, that he had registered the unfairness of it. But then, as if burned by the sight, he turned back to his screen, his fingers moving over the glass surface, swiping through documents and emails. His detachment hung in the air, a passive consent that said more than words ever could. Naomi watched him, not with anger but with a sort of quiet acceptance. She had seen this before, the careful neutrality of those who preferred comfort over confrontation. It was safer to stay quiet, to pretend that nothing was wrong, to convince oneself that the problem wasn't real if it wasn't acknowledged. She had learned this truth early, in classrooms and on playgrounds, where silence often spoke louder than words. A few rows back, Mia stood partially hidden by the galley partition. Her hands moved mechanically as she straightened the service trays, but her eyes were fixed on Naomi. There was something raw in her expression, a mix of guilt and hesitation. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, to do something, but fear held her still. Naomi could see it, the tightness in Mia's posture, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the neat rows of glasses. Mia's gaze darted to Mrs. Harper, who continued her rounds with a serene smile, every interaction a stark contrast to how she had treated Naomi. When Mrs. Harper glanced over, Mia's shoulders hunched, and she quickly busied herself, her hands a blur as she wiped down an already clean surface. Naomi felt a pang of sympathy. Mia wasn't an enemy. She was just another bystander, trapped by circumstance. A young woman caught in the shadow of authority. The space around Naomi felt fragile, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. She could sense it in the subtle shifts of the other passengers, the way their eyes moved without turning their heads, how conversations dipped into whispers when she was near. The first-class cabin, usually a bubble of privilege and comfort, had become a stage where everyone played their roles carefully. Naomi was the invisible girl. Mrs. Green was the invisible girl, Mrs. Harper the gatekeeper, Martha the quiet ally, Mr. Grant the indifferent witness, and Mia the hesitant observer. Each of them bound by the thin threads of expectation, politeness, and the unspoken rule that keeping the peace was more important than confronting the truth. Naomi's phone remained in her bag, the message from her father a quiet reminder to stay calm. She considered texting him again, but a part of her resisted. She didn't want to be the girl who needed rescuing, who couldn't handle a simple situation on her own. But the more she sat, the more the reality of it gnawed at her. This wasn't just about water. It was about being seen, being acknowledged, being treated with the same courtesy as everyone else. It was about not being made to feel small or out of place in a space she had every right to occupy. She had always believed that respect was earned, that if she remained polite and patient, the world would respond in kind. But this silence, this careful avoidance, was teaching her a different lesson. One about the quiet ways people could reinforce walls without ever saying a word. Martha's hand settled gently on Naomi's arm, a soft squeeze that spoke volumes. "You did nothing wrong," she murmured, her voice steady. Naomi met her gaze, the warmth of Martha's presence a small shield against the coldness around her. But even with Martha's support, Naomi felt the sting of isolation, the sharp edge of being othered, of being the exception in a room full of acceptance. She drew a slow breath, letting the air fill her lungs, centering herself. Her father's words echoed in her mind, a reminder of who she was, of the strength that ran deep beneath her calm exterior. She would not let this moment define her. She would not let Mrs. Harper's dismissal settle into her bones, into the spaces where confidence lived. Naomi sat straighter, a quiet force, the storm within her building strength, waiting for the right moment to break. Naomi sat still. The quiet hum of the airplane engines, a dull backdrop to the louder thoughts circling in her mind. She traced the edge of her phone case with her thumb, the smooth plastic cool against her skin. A part of her wanted to pull it out, to text her father again and tell him how much worse it had gotten. But what would she say? That a simple request for water had turned into something much heavier, much sharper, a blade hidden in the guise of polite service? She didn't want to sound dramatic, didn't want to seem like she was blowing things out of proportion. Yet no matter how she tried to reshape the experience in her head, the edges remained jagged. Her fingers curled around the strap of her bag, the leather soft and worn, a familiar comfort in this increasingly uncomfortable space. Her thoughts twisted themselves into knots. Was it just bad service, a flight attendant having a bad day, or was it something more insidious? Something that lay beneath the surface of every interaction, hidden but always there. Naomi had grown up knowing that the world saw her differently. Her parents had taught her to be aware, to recognize the subtle ways people's gazes would linger, how voices could shift ever so slightly when speaking to her. She had learned to navigate these moments with a practiced ease, offering smiles and soft answers, keeping her head high but her steps careful. But now, as she sat in this first-class seat, surrounded by the quiet luxury of polished wood and soft lighting, she felt that awareness deepen into something raw and aching. She wasn't sure if it was the way Mrs. Harper had looked at her, or how the woman's voice had flattened into that cold, impersonal tone. Or maybe it was the way the other passengers had chosen to look away, as if ignoring the moment could erase it. It all felt pointed, like an invisible finger pressing against her, reminding her that she was different, that her presence here was somehow a question mark in a room full of periods. She opened the in-flight magazine, the pages glossy and filled with cheerful images of far-off places. She tried to focus on the words, on the bright colors and curated smiles, but the text blurred, her mind too restless to settle. She flipped through the pages, each turn a little sharper than the last. The sound of paper against paper, a small rebellion against the quiet. Her breath moved in and out, shallow and quick, her pulse a steady beat beneath her skin. She closed the magazine and set it aside, her hands resting in her lap, fingers twisting together as if they could tie up all the loose ends of her thoughts. Naomi glanced at Martha, whose eyes were closed, her breathing slow and even, a picture of calm. She envied it, the way Martha seemed to cocoon herself in her own space, untouchable by the chill that had settled over the cabin. Naomi wanted to ask her if this felt wrong, if what had happened was as unfair as it seemed, but the words sat heavy on her tongue. She didn't want to break the quiet. didn't want to make more of the moment than it deserved. But deep down, she knew this wasn't about just a glass of water. It was about how easy it had been for Mrs. Harper to dismiss her, how natural it had seemed for the world to continue turning, the passengers around her sinking into their seats, their comfort undisturbed. Her phone remained tucked away, the screen dark. She thought about her father's earlier message, the way his words had felt like a promise. Stay calm. I'm handling it. He had always been her rock, his calm presence a constant reminder that no storm could last forever. But how could he handle this? What could he do from so far away? Naomi's mind spun through possibilities, each one more implausible than the last. Maybe he had called the airline. Maybe he was talking to someone right now. Or maybe he was simply waiting, trusting that his daughter, wise beyond her years, would find her own way through this. The thought brought a flicker of warmth to her chest, a small light in the dimness of her uncertainty. She took another breath, deeper this time, letting it fill the tight spaces beneath her ribs. Her mother had always said that breathing through the uncomfortable moments gave them less power, that every slow exhale was a reminder of her own strength. Naomi focused on the rhythm, counting each breath until the tightness began to loosen, the storm in her mind settling into a quiet, steady rain. She could do this. She could sit here, present and strong, and not let Mrs. Harper's coldness seep into her bones. She was more than a single moment of dismissal, more than the silent stares and the weight of being the only one to speak up. She was Naomi Green, smart, kind, unyielding. The plane hummed along its path through the sky, each mile bringing her closer to New York City, to a new adventure, to a place where the world might feel bigger and the spaces between the lines might be a little wider, a little freer. And as she sat there, her shoulders straight and her chin lifted, Naomi made a promise to herself. She would not let this moment define her. She would hold tight to the knowledge of her own worth, and no amount of silence or sidelong glances could take that from her. Naomi sat quietly, her posture composed and her hands resting gently in her lap. She had decided to let the moment pass, to wait patiently, as if every other passenger around her. Her father's words still echoed in her mind, a gentle reminder to stay calm, to trust that things would be handled. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension simmered. She focused on her breathing, on the rhythm of the plane's gentle hum, using it as a lifeline to keep her grounded. But then Mrs. Harper's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear, as if slicing through the delicate veil of quiet that hung over the first-class cabin. Some people think they belong everywhere, but not everyone fits in first class, she said. Her words wrapped in a veneer of politeness but threaded with a bitterness that made the hair on Naomi's arms stand up. The statement hung in the air, a fog that seemed to settle over every seat, every passenger. Conversations dipped into silence. The soft clinking of glasses paused, and several heads turned, their eyes finding Naomi in a collective, almost synchronized motion. Heat flooded Naomi's cheeks, a burn that crept up her neck and settled just beneath her skin. She felt it bloom across her face, not from shame but from the harsh spotlight of undeserved attention. Her grip tightened around the armrests, the cool leather biting into her palms. She met the gazes of the passengers around her, a soft yet unwavering defiance in her eyes. She would not look away, would not shrink into herself. The old lesson of holding her head high, of not letting the world press her down, surfaced with a new urgency. Her breathing remained steady, but beneath her calm exterior, a storm raged, the winds of injustice whipping against the fragile walls of her patience. Martha's voice rose softly, a gentle counter to Mrs. Harper's sharpness. "There's no need for that," she said, her tone a blend of kindness and quiet strength. Her hand reached over, a light touch on Naomi's arm, a gesture that felt like a shield. Martha's expression was steady, her silver brows drawing together as she addressed Mrs. Harper. The older woman's presence seemed to shift the air, creating a small bubble of safety around Naomi, a momentary reprieve from the judgment that seemed to press in from all sides. Mrs. Harper turned slowly, the practiced smile on her face a mask that barely hid the disdain beneath. Her lips curved, but her eyes remained cold, a mismatch that sent a chill through the cabin. "I'm simply doing my job," she said, her voice honeyed but laced with venom. "Some of us understand the rules of proper conduct." She turned away before Martha could respond, her steps measured, a performance of control. Naomi swallowed hard, the motion tight and dry in her throat. She felt as if the air had thinned, each breath a little harder to draw in, as if the entire cabin was waiting for her to respond, to make a scene, to fit the narrative Mrs. Harper had set. She remained still, the only sign of her turmoil the slight tremor in her fingertips. She refused to give Mrs. Harper the satisfaction of seeing her break, of watching her fold under the weight of such a thinly veiled insult. Her silence became a strength, a choice rather than a defeat. It was a refusal to play into the expectation that she would react, that she would validate Mrs. Harper's assumptions by giving her a reaction to manipulate. Instead, Naomi focused on Martha's touch, the soft reminder that she was not alone, that kindness still existed even in the shadow of cruelty. Around them, the cabin began to breathe again. Conversations resumed, though quieter, more cautious. Mr. Grant shifted in his seat, his tablet now a thin barrier between him and the unfolding scene. His fingers tapped lightly on the screen, a pretense of focus that did little to mask the tension in his shoulders. He had heard, just as everyone else had, but his response was a careful retreat into his own space, a silent declaration that this was not his fight. Mia stood near the galley, her hands clenched around the handle of a serving cart. Her eyes were wide, a mix of fear and regret swirling in the soft hazel. She looked as though she might step forward, might say something, but then Mrs. Harper glanced her way, and Mia shrank back, her lips pressing into a thin line of acquiescence. Naomi's pulse steadied, the initial sting of Mrs. Harper's words fading into something harder, more resolute. She could feel the shift within her, a quiet snapping of a thread that had held her doubts and insecurities together. This was not just a passing moment of rudeness. It was a reminder of the unspoken rules, the invisible lines that some believed she was not meant to cross. Her father had taught her about these lines, had warned her that they would appear in places she least expected, in classrooms, in parks, in boardrooms, and yes, even in first-class cabins. But he had also taught her how to draw her own lines, how to carve out her space in a world that often tried to box her in. She straightened in her seat, her spine a line of unbroken strength, her fingers unclenched, releasing the armrests and settling gently on her knees. She did not need to respond to Mrs. Harper's comment, because the truth of who she was did not require validation. She was Naomi Green, a young girl with a brilliant mind and a heart full of curiosity. She had earned her place here, and no sideways glance or biting comment could change that. As the plane continued its steady course through the sky, Naomi felt the ground beneath her own sense of self solidify. She was not out of place. She was exactly where she was meant to be, and no one, not Mrs. Harper, not the silent bystanders, could take that from her. Naomi's finger pressed the call button with a quiet determination, the soft chime ringing through the cabin like a bell breaking through the heavy silence. Heads turned subtly, eyes shifting from behind the safety of tablets and magazines, curiosity peeking through the practiced indifference. The sound seemed to slice through the comfortable hum of the airplane, creating a ripple of discomfort that spread from seat to seat. Naomi kept her gaze forward, her expression calm, but her heart beat steadily, each pulse a reminder that she was still here, still standing her ground in the quietest way she knew how. Mrs. Harper appeared at the end of the aisle, her steps clipped and precise. Her face, once a mask of professional composure, now showed cracks. Annoyance simmered beneath her polished surface. She moved toward Naomi, her presence a shadow stretching over the row, a force that seemed to draw the air out of the space around them. She stopped just short of Naomi's seat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the skin over her knuckles taut and pale. "What is it now?" she asked, her voice devoid of the warmth she had so easily shown the other passengers. Naomi met her gaze directly, her own expression a careful balance of politeness and persistence. "I'd like a glass of water, please," she said, her voice steady, the request as simple as it had been the first time. There was no edge to her tone, no hint of the frustration she felt building under her skin. She kept her words precise and clear, a deliberate choice to match Mrs. Harper's professional facade with her own quiet grace. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The cabin fell silent, a hush settling over the seats, as if the entire plane had paused to witness this exchange. Mrs. Harper's lips pulled into a tight line, the smile gone, leaving only a thin veneer of civility. Her nostrils flared slightly, a breath in, sharp and controlled. "You need to know your place, young lady," she snapped, the words slipping out with a venom that seemed to stain the air between them. The statement hung there, its meaning clear, each syllable pressing against Naomi like a physical weight. She felt the impact of it, the intentional sting of being told that she was out of line, that her presence here, her voice, her need for something as simple as water, was somehow too much. The silence in the cabin deepened, becoming something dense and oppressive. The passengers around them remained still, their discomfort now palpable. Naomi could feel their eyes on her, a mix of pity, confusion, and something else. A hesitation, as if they were waiting to see if she would falter, if she would bend under the pressure of Mrs. Harper's disdain. But Naomi's resolve only hardened. She had been taught to recognize moments like this, to understand the layers beneath the words, the way prejudice often dressed itself up as propriety. Her father had always told her that true strength wasn't about how loud you could be, but how steady you could remain when the world tried to push you down. She took a slow breath, letting it fill her lungs, the air cool and grounding. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering. "I've asked politely," she said. "I would appreciate being treated with the same respect as everyone else." Her words moved through the silence, a thread of truth weaving its way through the moment, pulling at the seams of Mrs. Harper's practiced control. Marta, who had been silent, shifted beside Naomi, her expression a blend of support and quiet anger. Her hand moved to cover Naomi's, a small gesture, but it felt like an anchor, a reminder that not all the world was sharp edges and cold shoulders. Across the aisle, Mr. Grant lowered his tablet slightly, his expression caught somewhere between discomfort and curiosity. His neutrality began to fracture, the mask of indifference slipping as he watched the interaction unfold. Mia, standing near the galley, took a step forward, her hands trembling around a plastic water bottle. She hesitated, her gaze darting between Mrs. Harper and Naomi, caught in the crossfire of a battle fought not with raised voices, but with the quiet strength of standing firm. Mrs. Harper's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. The control she wielded with such confidence now seemed to waver, the edges of her authority fraying in the face of Naomi's calm defiance. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she straightened, the movement sharp and final, and without another glance, she turned and walked away. Her departure left a void, a space where the tension hung thick and heavy, pressing down on everyone in the cabin. Naomi remained still, her composure a shield, her quiet strength a reminder that power did not always need to be loud to be heard. She felt the shift around her, the subtle change in the air, as if the plane itself had taken note of what had just happened. Her pulse steadied, the rush of adrenaline fading into a calm resolve. She had spoken up, had refused to be made small, and while Mrs. Harper's words had been meant to diminish her, Naomi knew that, standing her ground had only made her presence more powerful. She sat back, her posture still poised, and let the silence settle around her, knowing that this story was not yet over, and the next chapter was hers to write. Mia stood near the galley, her back partially turned to the cabin, but her phone held low and steady in her hand. The device's camera was angled just enough to capture the scene unfolding between Naomi and Mrs. Harper, the small lens an unblinking witness to the exchange. Her thumb moved quickly over the screen, a message forming under her nimble fingers. "I think I'm witnessing a lawsuit in the making." She sent it to her friend, a quiet ping confirming it had gone through, the weight of her actions settling over her like a shadow. Mia's heartbeat quickened, a mix of fear and a faint, flickering hope that what she was doing might matter. She had seen moments like this before, in whispers and glances, in the way certain passengers were treated differently, their requests met with a coolness that did not match the warmth offered to others. She had told herself it wasn't her place to intervene, that keeping her head down was safer. But now, watching Naomi sit with her shoulders straight and her expression unyielding, something inside Mia shifted. She knew what it was to feel small, to feel like her voice would only echo back in silence if she dared to use it. But Naomi's quiet defiance was a thread she could follow, a reminder that standing on the sidelines didn't absolve her of responsibility. Naomi remained still, her gaze fixed forward, a point of calm in the center of a storm. She could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin, the subtle shifts as passengers moved in their seats, their discomfort a tangible thing. Some of them glanced her way, their expressions flickering between sympathy and self-preservation, the universal dance of deciding whether to engage or retreat. Naomi understood it too well, the fine line between wanting to help and fearing the cost of stepping into someone else's battle. She didn't blame them, not entirely. She had been in their shoes before, had watched as someone else became the focus of attention and chosen silence as the safest option. But now, with the roles reversed, she felt the sting of it. The isolation of standing alone in a room full of people. It was a loneliness that settled deep, a cold space just under her skin, but within it, she also found strength. Her father's voice played through her mind, steady and clear, reminding her that strength wasn't always about winning battles, but about standing firm when the world tried to push you down. She could almost hear him, the warmth of his presence a comfort even from miles away. "Stay calm, I'm handling it." Those words were a promise, a lifeline that she wrapped around herself, letting it hold her steady. The atmosphere in the cabin had thickened, the air heavy with unsaid words. Conversations dipped into quiet murmurs, and the rustling of newspapers and the soft chime of tablets felt like two loud whispers in the silence. A few passengers exchanged looks, brief connections of understanding or perhaps guilt. Mr. Grant had lowered his tablet entirely now, his hands resting over the case, fingers drumming an uneasy rhythm. His expression was unreadable, a mask of neutrality that slipped at the edges, revealing hints of discomfort. He seemed to want to say something, his mouth opening slightly before he thought better of it, the moment passing with a quiet sigh. Martha, still seated beside Naomi, exhaled slowly, her own tension visible in the way her knuckles had turned white against the fabric of her skirt. She hadn't moved since Mrs. Harper's last words, her body a statue of quiet defiance. But Naomi could feel the warmth radiating from her, a reminder that at least one person here stood with her, even if only in silence. Mia's phone buzzed softly in her hand, a reply from her friend. "Be careful, this could get messy." The words sent a shiver through her, a reminder of the line she was walking. Her role was to serve, to assist, to maintain the delicate balance of comfort and service expected in first class. But her instincts told her this was more than a simple service issue. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of the water bottle she had been holding. She tightened her grip on it, the condensation dampening her skin, grounding her in the moment. She took a step forward, and then another, her body moving before her mind could catch up. Her feet carried her toward Naomi's row, the distance between them both impossibly short and endlessly long. But just as she drew close, Mrs. Harper's figure filled the aisle again, her presence a wall that Mia couldn't find the strength to climb. The senior flight attendant's expression remained fixed, a porcelain mask that only cracked at the edges, where her eyes held a warning. Mia hesitated, her body freezing mid-step, and then she turned away, slipping back into the safety of the galley, her courage retreating just as quickly as it had surfaced. Naomi watched Mia's movements, the brief surge of hope snuffed out as quickly as it had ignited. Her chest tightened, a dull ache spreading through her ribs. She was alone again, the realization settling in with a finality that tasted bitter. But even as the loneliness curled around her, she refused to let it pull her under. She sat straighter, her hands still and steady, her breathing even. The room could close in around her, the walls could press tight, but she would not let them break her. The silence in the cabin remained, a fragile glass that could shatter with the slightest pressure. Naomi understood now that this battle might be hers alone to fight, but the strength within her had grown roots, deep and unyielding. The story unfolding here was far from over, and the role she played was not one of a victim, but of a warrior, quiet but fierce, a force waiting for the right moment to rise. The intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin, smooth yet edged with a firmness that drew every passenger's attention. "Mrs. Harper, report to the cockpit immediately." His words hung in the air, a sudden disruption to the strained silence that had settled over first class. Heads turned, a ripple of curiosity and confusion spreading through the rows as the passengers tried to gauge what was happening. Mrs. Harper, who had been pouring a glass of champagne for a passenger 2 rows ahead, froze. Her posture, usually so composed and poised, stiffened, the delicate balance of her practiced demeanor beginning to unravel at the edges. She set the glass down slowly, the crystal ringing softly against the polished tray, and for a brief moment, her mask slipped. A flash of uncertainty breaking through. Her confident stride faltered as she moved toward the front of the plane, every step more hesitant than the last. The click of her heels against the carpet, an echo of something brittle and fragile. Naomi watched her go, her own expression carefully controlled, a mirror of the calm she had worked so hard to maintain. She didn't allow herself the satisfaction of a smile or the release of a sigh. Instead, she sat still, a quiet storm of emotions swirling beneath her surface. Relief, vindication, and an edge of uncertainty. She didn't know what was coming next, but she felt the shift in power, the invisible threads of control slipping from Mrs. Harper's grasp. As the senior flight attendant disappeared behind the cockpit door, a new energy filled the space. A soft hum of anticipation that wound its way through the cabin. It was as if the plane itself had inhaled, holding its breath along with everyone on board. The passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity now tinged with the realization that something significant was unfolding. Mia moved quietly through the aisle, her hands clutching a chilled bottle of water. Her approach was different this time. No hesitation, no sidelong glances toward the galley where Mrs. Harper had held sway. Her steps were soft, her presence almost weightless, but the resolve in her eyes was unmistakable. She reached Naomi's row, kneeling slightly to bring herself to Naomi's level, her expression open and earnest. She twisted the cap off the bottle and handed it over, her hands trembling just a bit as their fingers brushed. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight that went beyond the simple apology. It was a confession, an admission of all the things she hadn't said earlier, all the moments she had let pass in silence. Naomi accepted the bottle, her grip steady, and nodded once. There was no need for more words. The exchange between them was quiet but profound. A bridge built between 2 souls who understood, each in their own way, what it meant to feel powerless, and the strength it took to push through that feeling. The soft crackle of the intercom returned, and this time the captain's voice was closer, more immediate. The curtain at the front of the cabin shifted, and he stepped out, his presence a calm yet commanding force. He was a tall man, his uniform pristine, every line of his posture speaking to the discipline and authority he carried, not just as the pilot, but as the leader of this small world at 30,000 feet. His eyes moved over the passengers, pausing briefly on Naomi before settling into a gentle but serious expression. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, as if he wanted to give the moment the gravity it deserved. The passengers quieted further, their whispers fading into a hush, the attention of every person now drawn to the front of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice even and clear. "I would like to address a situation that has come to my attention during this flight. It is our commitment at this airline to ensure every passenger feels valued, respected, and treated with the utmost courtesy." His gaze remained steady, his words finding their mark not only with Naomi but with everyone listening. "Unfortunately, it appears that this standard was not upheld, and for that, I want to extend my sincerest apologies on behalf of our crew and our airline." Naomi felt the eyes of the cabin on her, the attention both a spotlight and a shield. The captain's words washed over her, each one a balm to the sting of Mrs. Harper's earlier treatment. His acknowledgement was more than just an apology. It was a validation of her experience, a public recognition that what had happened to her was not acceptable. His voice remained steady, offering a promise not just to her, but to everyone on board. "If at any time during this flight you feel that your needs are not being met, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself or another member of our crew. We are here to serve you, and we are committed to making this journey as comfortable as possible." There was a pause, a moment where the weight of his words settled into the space, and then he turned to Naomi directly, his tone softening but losing none of its sincerity. "Miss Green, on behalf of our entire team, I apologize for how you were treated. It was not right, and it will not be ignored." Naomi nodded, her voice caught somewhere in her throat, the strength of her earlier resolve now tempered by a wave of gratitude and a sense of justice being restored. She managed a quiet thank you, her words small but carried by the silence around her. The captain returned her nod, a silent exchange of respect, before he straightened and addressed the cabin once more. "We appreciate your understanding and thank you for your patience. We will continue with our service shortly. If you need anything, please do not hesitate to ask." With that, he turned and disappeared back through the curtain, his presence leaving behind a calm that smoothed the frayed edges of the cabin's atmosphere. As the cabin resumed its rhythm, Naomi sipped the water Mia had given her, the cool liquid a soothing contrast to the heat of the earlier confrontation. Around her, the passengers seemed to breathe easier, their unease dissolving into a more natural calm. Martha patted Naomi's hand gently, a soft murmur of, "Well done, dear," passing between them. Even Mr. Grant, who had remained so still and quiet, offered a small nod of acknowledgement. The balance had shifted, the power restored to its rightful place, and as Naomi sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the plane and the soft murmur of voices, she felt something settle inside her, a certainty that she had done the right thing, that her voice had mattered, and that this story was far from over. The plane hummed steadily, a low and constant vibration beneath the soft murmurs that filled the first-class cabin. Naomi sat in her seat, the cool bottle of water still in her hand, its condensation dampening her fingers. She took a sip, the cold liquid soothing her dry throat, but the calm in the air felt fragile, as if one wrong move might shatter it. The passengers had returned to their books and screens, but there was a charge in the air, a sense that something unspoken lingered just beneath the surface. The captain's public apology had settled the immediate tension, but curiosity and speculation now threaded through the silence, weaving a tapestry of unanswered questions. A few minutes passed, the soft rustle of pages and the quiet taps of fingers against tablets the only sounds. Then, from the front of the cabin, the curtain shifted again, and a new figure stepped through. Another flight attendant, her uniform just as crisp as Mrs. Harper's had been, but her expression open and calm. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the rows until they settled on Naomi. She approached slowly, her movements unhurried but deliberate, and when she stopped beside Naomi's seat, she crouched slightly, bringing herself to Naomi's level. "Ms. Green," she began, her voice low and warm, "I wanted to personally apologize for how you've been treated. We are taking this matter very seriously. Please know that your comfort and well-being are our top priorities." Naomi nodded, the gentle words a balm to the earlier sting. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. The flight attendant smiled softly, then added, "If there's anything you need, anything at all, Please don't hesitate to let me know." She stood smoothly, offering Naomi another small nod before retreating to the galley. Around them, the passengers exchanged looks, their curiosity now peaked to a near palpable level. Whispers threaded through the cabin, soft and speculative, as people pieced together the fragments of the unfolding situation. Naomi remained calm, her expression serene, but beneath the surface, her thoughts churned. The new flight attendant's demeanor had been markedly different, more formal, more cautious, as if Naomi were not just another passenger, but someone whose opinion carried weight, whose treatment would not go unnoticed. It felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her, and the balance of power had subtly realigned. She wasn't sure how, but something told her this was no ordinary apology. The answer came moments later, when the captain returned, his presence again drawing the attention of the entire cabin. His posture remained relaxed, his expression calm, but his eyes held a new light, a blend of respect and resolve. He approached Naomi directly, standing just at the edge of her row. "Miss Green," he said, his voice clear, "I wanted to inform you that Mrs. Harper has been removed from her duties for the remainder of this flight. The airline does not tolerate any behavior that compromises the comfort and respect of our passengers, and appropriate actions are being taken to ensure this does not happen again." His words were measured, each syllable a small weight dropped into the pool of silence, sending ripples through the room. The passengers leaned closer, some openly staring now, their earlier hesitance replaced with open intrigue. Naomi felt a shift inside her, a warmth spreading from her chest outward. It wasn't just relief, but a deep, resonant sense of being seen, of her voice carrying the impact it deserved. She thanked the captain quietly, her gratitude genuine but tempered by the understanding that this was more than just an apology. This was accountability, a rare and powerful thing. As the captain turned to address the rest of the passengers, his words widened the lens of the story that had been unfolding. "We hold ourselves to a high standard of service and equality on all our flights," he announced, his voice carrying to the back of the cabin. "Today that standard was not met, and we are committed to correcting this and learning from it. We appreciate your understanding and patience." The reaction was swift and varied. A few passengers clapped immediately, their applause hesitant but sincere. Others whispered, their voices threading through the air, soft currents of speculation and approval. Mr. Grant, who had spent most of the flight buried in his work, set his tablet aside and gave a single firm nod, a silent gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps a bit of respect. His earlier neutrality had faded, replaced by a quiet recognition of the strength Naomi had shown. Martha, who had been Naomi's steadfast ally, did more than nod. She lifted her hands, her palms coming together in a slow, deliberate clap. The sound was soft at first, almost timid against the weight of the moment, but she did not stop. Her rhythm remained steady, a heartbeat in the silence, and gradually, others joined in. The applause grew, each new set of hands adding to the swell, until it became a true wave. A surge of sound that rolled through the cabin. Naomi sat in the center of it, her cheeks warm, her pulse a steady beat that matched the tempo of the clapping. She did not bow her head or shy away from the attention. Instead, she held her place, her back straight, her expression composed. This was not just a moment of personal validation. It was a clear and undeniable statement that what had happened to her had not gone unseen. The applause tapered off gradually, leaving behind an air that felt lighter, clearer, as if the storm had finally passed, and the cabin could breathe again. Naomi turned to Martha, offering her a small, grateful smile. The older woman's eyes sparkled with a quiet pride, her earlier whispers of encouragement now given voice in the public acknowledgement of Naomi's strength. Even Mia, who stood at the back of the cabin with her hands folded neatly in front of her, allowed a small, hopeful smile to break through, her earlier fear now replaced by the glow of knowing she had done the right thing, even if only in a small way. Naomi knew this was not the end of the story. There would be conversations once they landed, perhaps even a broader reckoning for the airline, but for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. She had stood her ground, and the world had shifted to meet her. She had found her voice, and with it, the power to change not just her own experience, but, perhaps, to set a new standard for those who came after her. And as the plane continued its path through the sky, steady and sure, Naomi felt a sense of peace settle over her, a promise that no matter what came next, she was ready. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the wheels meeting the runway with a muted rumble that reverberated through the cabin. The usual chorus of seatbelts unclicking and overhead compartments opening was absent in the first-class section. Replaced by a tension that sat heavy in the air, passengers remained in their seats, eyes flicking between the aisle and the front of the plane, where two uniformed security officers stood waiting, their presence a stark reminder that this was no ordinary disembarkation. Mrs. Harper appeared from the galley, her once confident stride now reduced to a slow, hesitant walk. Her shoulders slumped, and her expression was a mask of resignation, the edges frayed and worn. She avoided eye contact, her gaze fixed on the carpeted floor as if the answers to where everything had gone wrong might be written there. The security officers stepped forward, their movements precise but not aggressive. They positioned themselves on either side of her, their hands resting at their sides, an unspoken escort that needed no explanation. The sight of Mrs. Harper, once the arbiter of control and authority on this flight, now reduced to a figure of quiet defeat, sent a ripple through the cabin. Some passengers averted their eyes, others watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort, but no one spoke. The sound of her footsteps, soft and measured, filled the silence, each step a reminder of how quickly power could shift, how swiftly justice could arrive. Naomi remained seated, her body still and composed, but her mind a rush of thoughts and emotions. She didn't revel in Mrs. Harper's downfall. There was no satisfaction in seeing another person brought low. But there was a sense of closure, a quiet understanding that actions had consequences, that respect was not just a suggestion but a requirement. As the last of the passengers began to file out, Martha gave Naomi's hand a final squeeze, her warm eyes conveying a world of unspoken support. "You take care, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice wrapping around Naomi like a blanket. Naomi nodded, her own words caught somewhere in her throat, but the gratitude in her expression spoke for her. A member of the flight crew approached Naomi, her demeanor professional but kind. "Miss Green, if you'll follow me, your father is waiting for you in the private lounge." The mention of her father sent a fresh wave of warmth through Naomi, a beacon pulling her through the remnants of this long and strange journey. She stood, gathering her bag, and followed the attendant through a private passageway that bypassed the bustling terminal. The walls around her were a blur of soft lighting and muted colors, but her focus was singular, every step bringing her closer to the one person whose presence would make everything right. The door to the lounge opened with a quiet hiss, and there he was. Jonathan Green, standing with his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed but his expression a study in controlled intensity. His suit was impeccable, a dark navy that offset his calm, strong demeanor, but his eyes told a different story. Beneath the composed exterior lay a storm, a protective anger that simmered just below the surface, restrained only by his deep love and respect for his daughter. When he saw Naomi, the storm calmed just enough for a small, soft smile to break through. "There's my girl," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Naomi crossed the room in a few quick strides, and as soon as she reached him, his arms enveloped her, strong and reassuring. She allowed herself to breathe, to let go of the weight she had carried alone for so many hours. "Are you okay?" he asked, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. Naomi nodded, her voice finding its strength again. "I'm okay now." His expression shifted, a flicker of something sharper passing through his eyes. "I've spoken to the airline. This isn't over." His tone was calm, but Naomi could hear the edge beneath it, the promise of action and accountability. She knew her father well enough to understand that when he said he would handle something, it was not just a promise, it was a certainty. "I know," she replied, her own calm reflecting his. They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the lounge a contrast to the storm that had passed and the ripples that were still moving outward. Naomi felt the solid ground beneath her feet, the unwavering support of the man who had taught her how to find her voice, and the knowledge that together they would ensure this story ended, not just with justice, but with change. Jonathan Green stood in the quiet, glass-walled conference room of the private airport lounge, his presence commanding even in the stillness. Across from him sat 3 airline executives, their suits as polished as their carefully measured expressions. Between them lay a document, crisp, neatly bound, a drafted press release that might as well have been a live wire on the polished mahogany table. Jonathan's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, slid the document forward with a practiced precision. Her expression was unreadable, a mirror of Jonathan's calm but unyielding resolve. The lead executive, a middle-aged man with silver at his temples and a practiced politician's smile, cleared his throat. "Mr. Green, let me assure you Mrs. Harper's behavior does not reflect our airline's values. She has been removed from her duties, and we are prepared to issue an apology to your daughter." His words were smooth, polished by years of navigating corporate crises, but Jonathan remained unmoved. His expression did not shift, his posture did not waver. When he spoke, his voice was steady, each word measured and deliberate. "An apology is a start, but it is not enough. Firing one person and sweeping this under the rug will not change the culture that allowed it to happen in the first place. I'm not interested in a band-aid solution. I want systemic change." The executives exchanged quick, uncertain glances, the confidence in their polished responses beginning to fray at the edges. Jonathan's lawyer opened the press release, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. The document outlined not only the incident on the flight, but a broader call to action: mandatory bias training for all staff, a transparent reporting system for discrimination, and a public acknowledgement of the airline's commitment to creating a safer and more inclusive environment for all passengers. The lawyer's voice was soft but firm as she read an excerpt, each line a quiet threat, wrapped in the language of accountability. "We will release this statement within the hour unless a formal agreement is reached," she concluded, her gaze never leaving the executives. The air in the room seemed to thin, the silence pressing in around them. The silver-haired executive's smile faltered, a slight shift that betrayed the uncertainty beneath his corporate mask. He looked to his colleagues, their faces reflecting a spectrum of apprehension, from tight-lipped caution to outright concern. They were not just negotiating with a powerful businessman, but with a father whose protective instincts had sharpened into a blade of uncompromising resolve. After a moment, the executive nodded slowly, his shoulders sinking, as if under a weight he could no longer carry alone. "We agree," he said, his voice quieter now, a hint of resignation softening the edges of his practiced tone. "We will implement the changes, publicly and transparently." Jonathan inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement that this was the first step. His lawyer closed the document, slipping it back into her briefcase with a quiet finality. The meeting concluded, not with a handshake, but with the understanding that this was not a negotiation, it was the beginning of a new standard. As Jonathan stood, the executives rose as well, their movements slower, more measured. He did not offer reassurances or soften his stance. Instead, he simply said, "I expect to see action, not just words. We'll be watching." And with that, he turned, the quiet power of his presence lingering long after he left the room. Naomi sat by the window of the private lounge, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass, its sharp lines softened by the afternoon haze. Her fingers traced the condensation on her water glass, a quiet rhythm that matched the steady hum of her thoughts. The weight of the day pressed against her, the swirl of emotions both a victory and a burden. She had stood up, had found her voice, and the world had listened, but the echoes of what it had taken to get here lingered in the quiet spaces between her thoughts. A soft shuffle of footsteps drew her attention, and she looked up to see Mia standing hesitantly a few feet away. The young flight attendant's shoulders were slightly hunched, her expression a mix of uncertainty and remorse. She clutched her hands together, the knuckles pale against her skin, and her lips parted, as if the words had to be coaxed into the open. "Naomi," Mia began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have said something sooner. I saw what was happening and I froze. I was afraid, but that's not an excuse. I'm so sorry." Her words spilled out, each one a fragile offering, a bridge built on the thin strands of vulnerability. Naomi studied her, the rush of conflicting emotions weaving tightly around her chest. She could see the truth in Mia's eyes, the quiet torment of knowing she had stood by, of wishing she had found her courage sooner. But Naomi also saw herself in Mia, the struggle to find strength, the fear of stepping into the light when the shadows felt safer. She took a breath, letting it fill the space between them, and then nodded gently. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said, her voice soft but certain. The simple statement held weight, a promise that redemption wasn't just a door closed behind you, but a path you could always choose to walk down. Mia's shoulders relaxed, a visible release of the tension that had held her in place. She offered a small, genuine smile, the kind that spoke of beginnings rather than endings. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice steadier now. "I promise I'll do better. I won't stay quiet again." Naomi returned the smile, a quiet understanding passing between them. It was a moment not of absolution, but of possibility, the acknowledgement that change often began with the smallest of steps, the quietest of voices deciding to speak. As Mia turned to leave, Naomi's gaze followed her, a gentle sadness settling into her chest. She had asked for water, something so simple, so universal, and yet the request had unraveled so much more. It had exposed the hidden seams of prejudice, the quiet complicity of silence, and the deep need for change. She felt both satisfaction and sorrow, the weight of knowing that change often came with discomfort, that justice was not always a clean victory, but sometimes a series of hard-earned, imperfect steps forward. Naomi closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of stillness. She had not set out to be a catalyst, but the truth had found her anyway, had wrapped itself around her and pulled her into the light. And now, as the world moved forward, she knew that this was not just the end of a story, but the beginning of a new chapter. One where voices, no matter how quiet, would always find a way to be heard. Naomi sat across from her father in the quiet of the lounge, the city beyond the window a blur of movement and light. Jonathan's expression was calm but thoughtful, his fingers steepled as he spoke. "You have a powerful story, Naomi. What happened to you, what you did in response, it matters. It could matter to a lot of people." His voice held no pressure, only a gentle encouragement, an acknowledgement of the strength she had already shown. Naomi knew what he was asking, but more importantly, she understood why. This wasn't about revenge or making an example out of Mrs. Harper. It was about shining a light on the shadows where prejudice thrived, about making sure that no one else had to sit in silence, feeling unseen and unheard. She nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling around her like a mantle. "Okay," she said, her voice clear. "Let's tell the story, but let's do it right." Her father's lawyer crafted a statement, truthful, precise, but not vindictive. Naomi recorded a short video, her voice steady as she recounted her experience, her focus not on the harm done to her, but on the need for broader change. She spoke not just for herself, but for anyone who had been made to feel small, to feel like they didn't belong. Her message was simple but powerful. Respect should not be a privilege, it should be a given. Her story was shared first on her father's corporate channels, but it quickly took on a life of its own. The video spread across social media, shared and reshared by voices big and small. Comments flooded in. Stories of similar experiences, words of support, and most importantly, a growing call for accountability. Naomi watched the ripple effect, the way her voice had become a catalyst, and felt a mix of pride and humility. What had started as a quiet request for water had become a wave of change, a movement carried by the truth and the courage to share it. The airline responded swiftly, their official statement released within hours of Naomi's story going public. The CEO appeared in a polished video, his expression grave but sincere. "We failed to uphold our values of respect and equality. We apologize to Miss Green and to anyone who has ever felt unwelcome on one of our flights. This is a wake-up call, and we intend to answer it with action." The airline announced a series of changes, including mandatory bias training for all staff, a transparent reporting system for discrimination, and a new focus on diversity and inclusion initiatives. They pledged to overhaul their customer service protocols, ensuring that every passenger, regardless of who they were or where they sat, would be treated with dignity and respect. Mrs. Harper's termination was part of the announcement, a consequence of her actions but not the end of the story. The airline committed to not only addressing individual behavior, but also examining the culture that had allowed it to go unchecked. They partnered with diversity experts, launched new training programs, and began a series of community outreach initiatives designed to support equality both within the company and beyond. The response was met with cautious optimism. Many applauded the swift action, while others reserved judgment, waiting to see if promises would translate into lasting change. For Naomi, it was never about punishing one person. It was about rewriting the narrative, ensuring that the next time someone pressed the call button, they would be met not with bias, but with the simple kindness of being seen and heard. She had taken a stand, and now the world was standing with her, not just for a moment, but for a movement. Naomi's story spread far beyond the confines of that airplane cabin. It became more than a viral video or a trending hashtag. It became a catalyst for real change. Organizations dedicated to social justice and equality reached out, inviting Naomi to share her story on larger platforms. Schools began using her video as a teaching tool in diversity training, showing students the power of speaking up against injustice. Naomi found herself not just a part of the conversation, but helping to lead it, her quiet strength inspiring others to find their own voices. Mr. Grant, the businessman who had sat silently across the aisle, found himself reflecting on his own role that day. His inaction had lingered with him, a dull ache of regret that pushed him to do more. He reached out to Naomi's family, not just with an apology but with an idea. Using his resources and connections, he established a scholarship in Naomi's name, aimed at supporting underprivileged students who showed leadership potential. "It's not just about making amends," he explained in a heartfelt letter. "It's about creating opportunities for voices like yours to rise and be heard." Naomi was touched, understanding that while he hadn't spoken up then, he was using his power to amplify the voices of others now. Mia, too, found a way to transform her guilt into action. The video she had recorded on her phone, the quiet, shaky footage of Mrs. Harper's behavior, became a crucial piece of evidence in the airline's internal investigation. When asked why she had recorded it, Mia's response was simple. "I couldn't find my voice then, but I knew this story needed to be told." Her courage to come forward strengthened the case for systemic change within the airline. She became an advocate for her colleagues, pushing for more transparent reporting systems that protected not only passengers, but also employees from the fear of speaking out. The airline's management acknowledged her bravery and, in a surprising turn, offered her a role in helping to shape their new training programs. For Mia, it was a second chance, not just to do better, but to help build a culture where silence was no longer the safest option. The ripple effect of Naomi's story extended into broader circles. Other airlines began evaluating their own practices, initiating changes preemptively to avoid similar incidents. The story was discussed on talk shows, written about in op-eds, and dissected in classrooms. It became a real-world example of how a single moment, a small act of defiance, could create a wave of accountability. Naomi, ever grounded, remained focused not on the attention, but on the impact. She continued her studies, her love for science undiminished, and balanced her newfound role as an advocate with the simplicity of being a young girl with big dreams. She spoke at events, not as a victim, but as a leader, her message clear: sometimes, all it takes is asking for a glass of water to show the world where the cracks are. And when you find those cracks, don't be afraid to shine a light through them. Through it all, Naomi and her father stood side by side, a reminder that strength and support often came in quiet, steadfast forms. The world moved forward, but the story remained, a testament to how standing up, even when sitting down, could change everything. Naomi sat at her desk, the soft glow of her laptop screen casting a gentle light across her room. The space around her was filled with the quiet comforts of home, books stacked neatly on shelves, photos of family vacations, and her favorite science awards lined up like small trophies of her curiosity. She took a breath, her fingers poised over the keyboard, and began to type. The title of her blog post appeared first, the words forming with a clarity that felt like a deep exhale. A glass of water when small acts reveal big truths. Each keystroke was a step back through the story that had started on that flight, a story that had become so much more than just about her. She wrote about the quiet discomfort of being ignored, the sharp sting of Mrs. Harper's words, and the powerful moment when she chose not to stay silent. Her words flowed, honest and unvarnished, describing how a simple request for water had pulled back the curtain on a much larger truth about respect, equality, and the courage to demand both. She shared the moments of doubt, the quiet strength of Martha's support, the hesitant bravery of Mia's recorded video, and the surprising redemption of Mr. Grant's scholarship. Her story wasn't just about standing up to injustice. It was about what happened when people decided that silence was no longer an option. As she finished the last sentence, Naomi leaned back in her chair, a gentle wave of peace washing over her. She had found her voice, not just in a single moment on a plane, but in the ongoing choice to share her story, to keep the conversation alive. Her blog post was more than a reflection. It was a promise to herself and to others that her story would not be just a momentary ripple, but a part of a broader current of change. She clicked publish, watching as her words became part of the world, a small light pushing against the shadows of complacency. The story drew to a close with a powerful message, not just as a conclusion but as a call to action. Naomi's words on the screen remained, a question lingering like a soft echo. How often do we let small injustices pass by, thinking they don't matter? What if the smallest act of courage could change everything? Would you speak up? It was more than just a question. It was a mirror held up to every reader, reflecting back their own choices, their own moments of quiet hesitance. It wasn't an accusation but an invitation, a chance to consider how everyday bravery could reshape the world in countless small but meaningful ways. Her story left a mark, not just as a tale of overcoming adversity, but as a reminder of the power each person held, the strength found in the simplest of actions. It wasn't just about asking for water. It was about asking for respect, for equality, for the right to be seen and heard. Naomi's journey showed that sometimes the most profound change started not with a grand gesture, but with a single steady voice saying, "This isn't right." And in the silence that followed, the world had finally listened. Naomi's story wasn't just about a single flight or a single moment. It was a reminder that even the smallest voice could create an echo. As she closed her laptop, she felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal victory. She had turned a moment of injustice into a message of hope and change, proving that sometimes the quietest strength could speak the loudest. Her journey wasn't over, and neither was the conversation. There were more stories to tell, more voices waiting to be heard, and that's where you come in. If Naomi's story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of their own worth. You never know how powerful a simple act of kindness or a word of encouragement can be until you see its ripple effect. Sharing her story isn't just about spreading awareness, it's about building a bridge for others who might feel alone in their own struggles. By sharing, you help ensure that voices like Naomi's continue to be heard, that the message of respect and equality reaches further than any single story ever could. And if you want to be part of more stories like this, ones that highlight strength, resilience, and the quiet power of standing up for what's right, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Together we are more than just spectators. We are participants in a conversation that challenges the status quo, that turns whispers into voices and voices into change. But this isn't just about listening. It's also about speaking up. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt unseen or unheard? Or maybe you witnessed something and didn't know how to respond? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and sharing it might just help someone else find their own strength. When we share, we connect. And when we connect, we create a space where no one feels like they have to face their battles alone. Let's keep the conversation going, not just here but in our everyday lives. Let's continue to ask the tough questions, to hold each other accountable, and to support those who need a hand to hold or a voice to amplify their own. Every story shared is another step towards a world where respect and kindness are not the exceptions, but the rule. Your story could be the next light that shines through the cracks, illuminating a path for others to follow. Thank you for being here, for listening, for caring. We're glad you're part of this community, one where silence is not an option, and every voice matters. As the story draws to a close, the screen softens to a gentle fade, transitioning seamlessly to an end screen that offers not just an end, but an invitation to continue the journey. Two videos appear side by side, their thumbnails vibrant and compelling. The first, titled "When Courage Changes Everything," features a young woman standing before a crowd, her face lit with determination. The second video, "Small Acts, Big Impacts," captures a candid moment of kindness. A helping hand, a shared smile, a reminder that even the tiniest gestures can reshape someone's world. Both videos are not just stories, but echoes of the same truth Naomi lived through. That real change often starts with a single step, a single voice choosing not to stay silent. Above the video suggestions, a soft animation draws the eye to a subscribe button, a gentle nudge to become part of a growing community of voices that believe in the power of standing up, of speaking out, of creating ripples of respect and kindness in their everyday lives. A bold, simple message fills the remaining space on the screen, its words a powerful echo of Naomi's journey. Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. Let's make sure everyone gets it. The text is clean and clear, the kind that resonates long after the video ends. It isn't just a statement, but a call to action. A reminder that every viewer has the power to influence the world around them. It encourages a shift from passive watching to active participation, urging the audience to carry the message forward into their own lives. The colors are soft yet confident, hues of blue and white that evoke both calm and strength. The words linger, giving just enough time for them to settle into the mind and heart before the video gently fades out. The overall feel of the end screen is not just about promoting more content, but about offering a continuation of the experience. It's an opportunity to dive deeper, to find new stories, to learn and to grow. Each element, the suggested videos, the subscribe call out, the text overlay, is designed to feel like an extension of the conversation, a bridge to the next chapter of learning and empathy. The end screen isn't a goodbye, it's a gateway. A reminder that stories like Naomi's are only the beginning, and that the next story waiting to be told could be the one that inspires someone else to stand up, to speak out, to change everything.